Hi, I'm Kristen Kosyluk. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Mental Health Law and Policy here at the University of South Florida. And I am here with my colleague, Nayla, to facilitate lesson number 1 of Up to Me, which is a program meant to help you decide whether or not to disclose a mental health challenge. And if you should decide to disclose, thinking about different ways to disclose and strategies for testing out people to see if they'd be a safe disclosure partner. So I'll let Nayla introduce herself real quick.
Hi, I'm Nayla. I'm a PhD student at the University of South Florida. I work in Dr. Kosyluk's lab, and I'm also a research coordinator on Up to Me.
Thanks, Nayla. So I already shared with you what the goals of this group are. So really, this is about considering the costs and the benefits of disclosing your experiences with mental health challenges to some people in your life. And that could be anybody. That could be a faculty member, that could be a friend or a roommate, that could be a mental health professional, it could be a neighbor, it could be a family member. And then also learning different strategies for disclosing most effectively. And sometimes you'll hear this referred to throughout this program as coming out. So what we mean by that is coming out of the closet, this kind of metaphor for going from a place where you're concealing your identity as living with a mental health condition, should you decide that that is an identity for you, and then moving into bringing that out into the public, right? The public's knowing of it. And you can do that in various settings. So you might just decide to disclose in one setting, and in another setting, decide that you're not going to disclose. So I will let Nayla introduce lesson number 1.
So the main thing that we're going to talk about today is trying to help you decide if Up to Me is the right decision for you. Up to Me is the right decision for some people, but not necessarily for everyone. So this section is really meant as a guide to help people decide what is the right decision for you. So we approach the decision in 2 main parts. First, we're going to talk about the idea of identity and mental illness, so you can decide how you frame your identity. Dr. Kosyluk touched on this earlier. Some of you might not identify as having a mental illness. That might not be a core part of who you are or how you would describe yourself, and that's okay. Up to Me might still be something that's relevant to you, even if you don't identify as having a mental illness. Secondly, we help you weigh the costs and the benefits of coming out so that you can decide whether or not you want to disclose. There's several different tables, and there's several tables that are already filled out, so we give you some ideas. So we mentioned worksheets and tables. Dr. Kosyluk and I have a physical manual that we're looking at in which we see the tables and manuals, but for the convenience of facilitating this meeting, we have put everything into an online survey platform, and you should have already received an email that tells you that incorporates a link that will take you to the lesson. So do not be concerned that it is only lesson 1 right now. You will receive lessons 2 and 3 as those dates come up.
Great. And in that email, Nayla, if I'm not mistaken, they also will get a copy of the manual in Word format, so they could have that open too if they wanted to. But really, we're really encouraging them to, as we go through these worksheets, complete them in the online survey that they're receiving.
Absolutely. And if you're worried about having a physical copy of these afterwards, once you complete everything in the survey platform and you hit submit, you will receive a PDF that has your responses in it. So if you ever want to refer back to it or change some things, you have that copy for yourself. So it is not lost just because it is in the survey platform and not in the Word document.
Great. That's perfect. Okay, so as Naila was providing an overview of lesson 1, which again is about considering the pros and cons of disclosing, she mentioned these 2 tasks. The first being the identity task, determining if you identify as living with a mental health condition. And then the second is weighing the costs and the benefits of coming out so that you can make a decision about whether or not you want to disclose in a given setting. So for task 1, there are several learning objectives associated with this, and you're seeing me glance down. It's because I am glancing down at my, again, physical copy of the manual, which looks huge compared to what you're going to receive as an attachment. So the learning objectives for this task are, first, to understand that some people don't want to view themselves as having a mental illness, as Naila mentioned, but others do. So this section is going to help us to understand whether or not we or you identify as a person living with a mental illness. Another important objective of this lesson is to understand that words are central to stigma. Really, what Up to Me is helpful with for many people is helping them to reduce a sense of internalized stigma that they experience as a result of living with a mental health condition or mental health challenges. So words are really important, and therefore, we want you to really consider how you want to label your experiences. You could choose to label them as mental illness. I used the term earlier, mental health challenges. Some people, prefer that. Other people will just say having a hard time. However you choose to refer to the experiences that brought you to this group is absolutely fine. And we want you to take ownership of that and not have to take on a label that you don't identify with. And then, the third objective is that some people agree with stigma, as I mentioned just a moment ago, and they beat themselves up about the experiences that they have with their mental health. If that is something that you find yourself doing, if you are aware that certain stereotypes exist about mental illness, for example, the idea that maybe people with mental illness are lazy, which is an untrue stereotype. But you still find yourself thinking like, why am I having trouble getting out of bed when, my roommate isn't? Then you might be challenged by self-stigma or internalized stigma. And there's an appendix in your manual that is titled Challenging Personally Hurtful Self-Stigma. We're not going to go through that together, but if you do, we're going to do an assessment of your level of internalized stigma or self-stigma. And if you do find that you're at a certain point on that scale, then you may want to go ahead and go through the appendix on your own. Okay. So moving into the actual workbook and the first task, which is the identity task. If you were following along in your physical manual, we'll call it physical, your Word document, you'd be on page 9 right now, I believe. Let me make sure that's the right one for the workbook, because I'm working from a manual and you have a workbook. So I'm glad I checked, because it would be page 6 of the workbook. I'm going to mark that for myself so I don't lose it. So on page 6 of the workbook are a couple paragraphs. One is a story about Marie, and the other is a little story about John Henry. And what these little blurbs are about is helping us to understand how someone might either A, identify as a person with a mental illness, or B, not identify as a person with a mental illness. So I want you to, if you don't mind, just pause the video for a moment and go ahead and read through those 2 blurbs. Those are also in the online platform link that you have to the activities that Naila shared with you a moment ago. So just pause the video for a moment, read through those couple paragraphs, and when you're finished, go ahead and unpause the video and we'll move forward. Okay, so welcome back. So you just read 2 blurbs again about Marie and John Henry. Marie identifies as a person living with a mental illness, whereas John Henry does not identify as a person living with a mental illness. Both are completely valid ways to view oneself, but very different ways to view oneself. So there is a worksheet in your workbook that's associated with these particular vignettes, and it is on page 7 of your manual. We want you to complete this, though, in the online survey that you received. So I'm just going to quickly review what this worksheet looks like, and then we're going to go ahead and pause for one more moment, give you a little bit of time to complete this, unpause, and we'll go through it together. So there's a couple of things about this particular worksheet. One is you're looking at Marie and John Henry's choices separately. First, considering Marie's choice to identify as a person living with a mental illness, and then second, looking at John Henry's choice to not identify as living with a mental illness. Now, there's pros and cons to each of these choices with regard to identity. So what you're going to want to do in this worksheet is, for Marie, outline what you think the pros for Marie are in identifying as living with a mental illness, and then what are some of the cons? And then similarly for John Henry, what are some of the pros of not identifying as living with a mental illness, and then some of the cons? Why don't we go ahead and do that piece quickly first, then we'll come together, we'll go through those two activities, and then we'll pause once more and allow you to complete the final task in this worksheet, which is deciding whether or not you identify as a person living with a mental illness. So go ahead and pause now, take a few minutes to fill out those first sets of boxes of pros and cons, and then unpause when you're finished. Okay, so there are several pros that we might identify for Marie as identifying as a person living with a mental illness. Number one, she might be able to obtain mutual support. So what mutual support means is she might be able to identify others who also live with a mental illness and therefore can support one another. She may feel empowered to claim that identity. A lot of times people living with mental health conditions feel like they have labels put upon them, but when they take charge and take that identity on themselves and accept that, sometimes they feel empowered. And then also this might help with relapse prevention. So a lot of times people will be doing just great. They'll be doing just great managing their mental health symptoms, and then something might happen and they have a more difficult time, and that's what we call relapse. So if you identify as living with a mental illness and you maybe share that with others, they can help you to identify if you're having additional challenges and might need a little bit more support. And then some of the cons associated with identifying with a mental illness is, this idea of vulnerability. Stigma does exist. And so if you accept that label and take it on, then you are then, possibly going to experience some stigma. You might experience scrutiny from others. Some people in this group in the past have said that once you identify as living with a mental illness, people start to view everything that you do through that lens. And then, you need to make sure that you have your own supports and then you're not just supporting others all of the time, because sometimes people will come to you for advice and things like that if they know that you identify as living with a mental illness. So you have to be able to, have good self-care and good boundaries. And then for John Henry, some of the pros of not identifying as living with a mental illness include not being the target of stigma. If you don't accept that label, then people won't place the stigma associated with mental illness upon you. Some of the cons is if you don't identify, you might not be able to access the support that you need or that mutual support that we mentioned earlier. It also takes a lot of energy to hide any identity. And so sometimes you might be left feeling a little exhausted from trying to hide your experience. And then also internalizing the struggle. So it makes it so that you have to deal with things alone as opposed to being able to deal with them outwardly or with support from others. So you may have had some of these same pros and cons when you completed this worksheet. You might have thought of different ones. But really the point here is for you to be able to go through this type of decision-making process for yourself. So on the bottom of the page, there's the page in the manual, but in the online survey, the next box says, do you identify with mental illness? What we'd like you to do is just pause your video briefly now and answer that question, yes or no, circle one of those, and then tell us a little bit about why or why not. And then when you're finished, you can unpause the video and we'll move forward. Okay, so now we're going to move on to section 2. You've decided whether or not you identify as a person living with a mental illness and why or why not. Section 2 is about, it's called What's in a Name. So there are other ways that we can refer to mental illness. And there are ways that we might talk about mental illness that could be stigmatizing, right? Or there are better ways to talk about mental illness that aren't stigmatizing. So what we want you to do in this first activity in section 2, or the only activity in section 2 actually, is to go ahead and in the box, provide some of the terms that you have either heard or maybe you yourself have used to refer to mental illness without using the term mental illness. Go ahead and pause your video now. And also there's a little question down there that says, how would you like to be referred to as a person that's participating in this group? How would you like to be identified? What terminology would you prefer to use? Pause your video now, fill this out. We'll go through a few examples when you unpause, and then we'll move on to section 3. Okay, so some of the terms that people who've participated in this group in the past have used or have put in this box of ways that people refer to mental illness without saying mental illness is psycho, crazy, schizophrenic, overly sensitive. What else? Some people have said things like, I'm having a rough go of it right now. One person that we've worked with in the past has said, I kind of feel like things are going sideways for me. So then, ask yourself, and you should have filled this out, how do you prefer to be referred to? Some people prefer what's called person first language. So they might prefer a person with schizophrenia as opposed to schizophrenic. It's putting the person before their diagnosis. Some people prefer a person with mental health challenges, others mental health issues. And my opinion, which is only mine, some people refer to themselves as survivors, right? And I think that, in my opinion, that's kind of an empowering term to use. People oftentimes will use the term recovery. So they'll say, I'm an individual in recovery. So whatever you have put there is just fine, because that is what you would like to use to refer to your experiences. And you can use that moving forward through all of these lessons in the workbook. So there's some worksheets that you're going to come across that are going to say person with a mental illness. And if that language bothers you, you can just strike through it. If you have a physical copy, or ignore it, pretend it's something else, replace it with that language that you prefer. Okay, so moving on to section 3, which is the last section in this task 1 of lesson 1. This is what I was talking about earlier whenever I said that we'll do an assessment to see how much self-stigma we might hold. So self-stigma, again, is when we're aware of the stereotypes that exist about mental illness. Some of the main ones are dangerousness, incompetence, and blame. And they're stereotypes because they're untrue, but we're bombarded with them daily through the media, largely. And so sometimes if we are experiencing a mental health challenge and we're aware of these stereotypes, we internalize them and they cause us hurt. And so that's what this activity is all about. So what I want you to do is pause your video for just a moment and complete these 4 items. So sometimes I agree with stigma, people with mental illness are weak. Sometimes I agree with stigma, I should feel ashamed of myself. Sometimes I agree with stigma, I think I am less of a person because I have a mental illness. And sometimes I agree with stigma, I can't reach my goals because of mental illness. So you're going to use the scale above those items, ranging from 1 is very much disagree to 7 is very much agree. So for example, sometimes I agree with stigma, people with mental illness are weak. If I agreed with that strongly, I would put a 7. If I didn't agree with it at all, I'd put a 1, and then I might fall somewhere in the middle there. So do that for each of those 4 items, and then if you're in the online survey, it'll give you a score, a total score. And so I mentioned that appendix that's at the end of the manual that we're not going to go through together, but it's there as a resource to you, which is called Challenging Personally Hurtful Self-Stigma. So if you end up scoring greater than a 20 on this activity, I might suggest going in and reviewing that appendix so that you can learn some strategies to help yourself so that you're not so affected by self-stigma. So go ahead and pause your video now. And when you're finished with that activity, if you want to review the appendix now, you may, or you might unpause and come back and review the appendix later. That's completely up to you. Just make sure that you do come back to us because we do have more lessons for you. Okay, welcome back. We are now going to complete section task. Are we on task 2 now?
Yes.
Task 2, and I'm going to hand it over to Nayla.
All right, everyone, welcome back. We're going to start task 2 now, which, as we said in the beginning, is all about weighing the pros and the cons of disclosing. So we don't want to sugarcoat it. Disclosing will always come with benefits and with costs. There's always a certain extent to which once you put stuff out there, you can't control it anymore. But there's also a lot of benefits. You might feel lighter, you might receive accommodations, you might feel empowered from being able to disclose your mental illness or your mental health challenge, whatever you identify with. So just to get you started, worksheet 1.2 already has some things filled out that might be reasons why people decide to disclose. So we're not looking at pros and cons just yet. We're just looking at why might you want to disclose, what might that make you feel, and what might motivate you. So you see that 1 through 4 is already filled out. You can look at it right now as I'm talking to you. So there's examples like telling the secret, which is one that I personally identify with a lot. I feel like if I keep it a secret, it makes it feel more shameful to me. And I feel like if I disclose it, it makes me feel like this is something that you can tell people and you won't be judged. There might also be practical reasons like receiving accommodations. If you have something like ADHD, you might want to let your professor know that this is something that you struggle with, and they might be able to give you more time on a test, or you might want to talk to student accessibility services, that kind of thing. So there's a couple of reasons outlined already. I would like you to pause in just a second and write down a couple more reasons that you can think of, things that aren't already in the list. And then you see that there's a little check box at the end. So go ahead and just put check marks next to the ones that you relate to, including ones that you might come up with. You might come up with reasons that you think somebody else might endorse, but you might not. So go ahead and pause the video for a second and fill out worksheet 1.2. All right, now that you've thought of some reasons why you might want to disclose, let's go through some of the benefits and the costs. So if you look at your worksheet, you see that there's 2 tables. The first one is about the costs and benefits of disclosing, and the second one is about the costs and benefits of not disclosing. So some of those might be in both tables, some of those might be a benefit of disclosing and a cost of not disclosing, but there might be other things that you can think of that don't go into both tables. So let's make a list of all the costs and benefits of coming out. First, let's focus on one at a time. So let's make a list and tell of costs and benefits. Let's make a list of all the costs and benefits of coming out, of telling other people about your experiences with mental illness. And benefits represent why you would do it, what you expect to happen that is positive as a result of disclosing, versus costs are reasons why you would not do it. That might be negative, or that might harm you, or that could be a negative result of disclosing. So let's write those down in table 1.1. So go ahead and pause your video now and think of some of those. And now that you have unpaused your video, you might have jumped the gun and already gone ahead and written down table 1.2, some of the costs and benefits of not disclosing. But if you haven't, go ahead and do that now. All right, welcome back. Now that you have a comprehensive list of pros and cons, only you can decide for yourself how those costs and benefits balance. It may not be a 1-to-1. You might not want to go, there's 3 pros but 2 cons, so I should disclose. One of those cons might be really, really big and non-negotiable. So it's up to you how you want to weigh those. There's no formula. We're not here to provide you with a definitive list of this is when you should disclose and this is when you shouldn't disclose. We're trying to help you find your own path to deciding whether you want to disclose or not. We also want you to think of some of the differences here in terms of costs and benefits that can be relative immediate versus ones that might be far out in the future or that might be delayed. For example, if you disclose on social media, you might feel really good about that now, but in a very distant future, you might want to take that back and you might not be able to because now it is out there. So that would be the difference between a short-term and a long-term benefit and cost. Yeah, generally people seem to be more influenced by immediate costs and benefits, but we're trying to help you think through the long-term costs and benefits as well. We also don't want you dismissing any costs or benefits as silly. If you put it on that list, then it's valuable to you, and things like feeling lighter is valid. Feelings are a valid reason to disclose or not to disclose, or a fear of judgment is also a valid reason to disclose or not to disclose. There's no shame in worrying that someone might judge you down the line. We also encourage you to put down all sorts of things now, and you can always decide later on when you circle back to this list and you look at it that this might not be relevant anymore, and then you can take it off. But for now, let's just brainstorm and put everything on there that you can think of. All right, everyone. So if I could direct you to your workbook briefly, this will not be appearing in your survey in REDCap. You will have to open the workbook if you want to read Alan's story, but I will talk you through some of what Alan is considering. Alan is considering disclosing his mental health challenge in the classroom, and he's made a table of short-term benefits and short-term costs, as well as long-term benefits and long-term costs, something that I just started touching on. So for Alan, he thinks some of his short-term benefits would be helping him deal with his intimidating professor, not having to keep it hidden, identifying classmates with similar problems, and maybe making more friends in his class. Some costs would be classmates won't ask him to lunch, so we're thinking of some very specific short-term costs, and worrying about how others will talk about him behind his back, and maybe getting left out of study group sessions. So most of the short-term costs are related to fears of exclusion as a result of his disclosure. Some of the long-term benefits are His professor might provide extra help. He might get class accommodations, and he might be able to avoid dropping or failing the class. Long-term costs might be that his classmates don't want to study with him, rumors might start about him, or he drops the class out of embarrassment. And so after making this list, Alan marked some of these pros and cons, or these benefits and costs, with little stars. So those are the ones that are really the most important to him. So when we're talking about balancing your pros and your cons and your benefits and your costs, you know, one way to do that is figuring out which ones are most important to you, which ones are the ones that you are most concerned about. So for Alan, he thinks the most important points are making more friends in class, avoiding dropping or failing the class, and his biggest cost is rumors may start about him. So after making this list and marking it with some stars, he decided that he would disclose. Your costs or benefits might be very different when you're disclosing to your fraternity or to your rugby teammates. You might know that those people hold different opinions and that might change it, or you might have less control over whether your disclosure stays within that realm. So if we move outside of the example of Alan, we see that some sort of general benefits and costs of coming out with your mental illness, as seen in table 1.4, might be you may worry that others will pity you. You might be concerned about gossip, as was Alan. You might fear some exclusion, as did Alan. Some benefits, however, are that you don't have to worry about hiding your mental illness. It can take a lot of work and effort and time and space in your mind to try and conceal your mental illness. You can be more open about your day-to-day affairs. Maybe you're taking some sort of medication for your mental illness and you have to sneak away to the bathroom to do that. You might others may express approval, might consider you brave for disclosing your mental illness, for example, or they might relate to you. They might tell you that they have similar experiences and you can feel less alone and you can relate and talk about that kind of stuff. However, we want to emphasize that your decision depends on the setting. So costs and benefits will vary on the setting, and we would encourage you not to have one master list of costs and benefits, but each time that you consider disclosing, you make a new list. You can make copies of the table in 1.3, or you can add on to a table that you already have. But we would encourage that you make a completely blank table each time. You can put at the top the setting, where it is that you are disclosing, and then fill out your costs and benefits anew based on who it is that you're disclosing to. Is it one person? Is it a group of people? How do you think they would react? What are the repercussions of that particular situation? These might be very different in a fraternity where there's perhaps more social implications than in a classroom where there's practical implications like accommodations. So these are the things that we would encourage you to weigh, and you can always consult table 1.4 and look at what you wrote down in the other tables to circle back if you feel like you can't come up with possible costs or benefits, or you're worried that you might be forgetting something or leaving something out. All right, I think now I'll hand it back to Dr. Kosyluk and she can talk you through the next worksheet that will help you make a decision.
Thanks, Nayla. So worksheet 1.3, reminder that you have that red cap survey that we would love for you to be using to complete these worksheets. But if you were looking in the manual that you received also as an attachment, it would be on page 17. This worksheet is meant to help you to walk through the short-term and long-term benefits and costs of disclosing in a particular setting to a particular person. So for Alan's example, it was in a classroom, but we talked about, that he might also decide to consider disclosing to his fraternity. And what really is going to dictate that decision is going to be the weighing of these long-term and short-term costs and benefits. Now, it's important to notice that, for Alan, he starred a couple of benefits and only one cost. It doesn't actually work that way numerically. It's not like it's like 2 is greater than 1, and so disclosure is my decision. Sometimes you might have 9 or 10 costs and only one benefit, but the benefit is so huge to you that you decide that you want to disclose anyway. This is really just about helping you to make that choice. So just wanted to make sure to point that out. And it is really important, as Nayla mentioned, to be considering context as opposed to having, like, as she referred to it, like this master list, because those costs and benefits are going to be changing depending on where you're deciding to disclose and to whom. So if you want to go to worksheet 1.3 now, as I mentioned earlier when we did the identity task, you're going to notice this worksheet is titled the Costs and Benefits Worksheet for Disclosing My Mental Illness. Now, if you don't identify as living with a mental illness, but maybe you identify as having some challenges or struggling or some other way, ignore the language. You can replace that language with whatever you feel comfortable. But whatever brought you to this group, deciding to disclose this piece of you, if you view it as a piece of you or an experience, let's call it that, you can use that language. So you see there's going to be a box in your worksheet that says setting and a box that says to whom. So first you're going to want to complete that. What setting are you thinking about? Is it a classroom? Is it a sports team? Is it a fraternity or sorority? Is it a religious community, family? That's the setting. And then to whom? So who's the particular person that you're thinking of sharing with? Once you've done that, go ahead and fill out the boxes for both the short-term benefits and short-term costs and long-term benefits and long-term costs. If you get stumped and you're having a hard time thinking of what some of the costs and benefits might be, I would try it yourself first just to see what you can generate on your own. But you could also go back to Alan's example, which is on page 13 of your workbook, or to table 1.4 on page 14 of your workbook to get some ideas of what you might put in those boxes. Pause your video now and do that, and then we'll go to the next section of the worksheet. Okay, so now you have filled out these boxes with the short and long-term benefits and costs. Pause once more for a second, go back to that list and place an asterisk, like a star, next to each of the benefits and costs that you think are the most important to you. And then when you're done, you can unpause. Okay, so now that you've done that, you have a table similar to the one that we viewed that Alan had created for himself about disclosure in a classroom setting. And you can now refer to this table. As Nayla mentioned, this will be emailed to you in a PDF. You can refer back to this table when you're actually facing this decision. If, say your setting was classroom, the day is over, you don't have class again until Monday, maybe it's the weekend, right? You can go and ponder that decision before you actually face the opportunity to disclose. So that could be useful to you. And again, this could change. You could change your mind about what's important to you. You could change your mind about what some of the costs and benefits are. You might think of additional costs and benefits. You can always go back to this and edit it later on. If you printed a copy for yourself, you could handwrite it in, or you could just think about it. So now that you've done that, given this table, take a little bit of time. You can pause this video for as long as you want, or maybe already, having done this worksheet, what your decision is. But what we'd like you to do is go ahead into the worksheet again in the survey, the electronic survey, and check one of the boxes. I have decided to disclose my mental illness. Again, you can replace mental illness with anything that you want. I have decided not to disclose my mental illness, or I've put off the decision for now. I'm just going to let it marinate. I'm not going to make a choice right now. Go ahead and pause the video, do that, and then we'll come back. Okay, so finally, what is important to consider when deliberating about whether or not to disclose a mental health condition is what is the goal for disclosure? In Alan's situation, Nayla mentioned this term a couple of times, accommodations. Those are little accommodations, little changes that can be made to the classroom environment to help make a student successful. Now, usually, just so that you know, to be officially entitled to an accommodation, a student would need to go through, at USF, it's called Student Accommodation and Support Services. They would document any kind of mental health condition or disability that you might have and send a letter on your behalf to a professor in advance of the beginning of the semester, letting them know these are the accommodations that the student is entitled to. Now, just in case you ever want to make use of something like that and you fear that disclosure piece, they do not disclose on your behalf. So all that the faculty member would know is that you are entitled to some accommodation, not why. So they wouldn't be like, they're entitled to extra time on a test because they have ADHD. They would just be like, point blank, they're entitled to this accommodation on a test. So make sure you're aware of that. Now, the goal for disclosure for Alan was maybe one of them was to get an accommodation, right? So that might be what he would write in that box. Or maybe it wasn't to get an accommodation. Maybe he was thinking of disclosing to a classmate so that he had support or could build a friendship with that person. That would be the goal to disclosing. Other goals might include starting a conversation, right? You might feel compelled to advocate for people living with mental health conditions. And so you might disclose for that reason, or to feel a sense of connection. Mental health conditions are very common. The statistics most often cited are 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 people live with a mental illness. So there's a pretty good chance that if you disclose to somebody that they might also share that experience and you might be able to support one another. So that could be a goal for you too. And then the other thing to think about is, and this is kind of going along with long-term benefits and costs, is what do you expect to happen after you disclose? And that should kind of be in alignment with your goal. So if your goal is to get an accommodation, then you expect to get an accommodation, right? If your goal is to connect with other people, then you might expect that other people will be empathic when you share your experiences. So go ahead, pause the video now and fill out those 2 boxes and then come back and we'll wrap up. Okay, this brings us to the end of lesson 1. We hope that you found this useful and that it has helped you to think about some of the reasons why you may or may not disclose. Again, just kind of an overview. We talked about identity. So you may or may not identify as a person living with a mental illness. Even if you don't identify with the term mental illness, you might have some experiences that would benefit from you reasoning through this decision-making process about disclosure, right? Whether you call it a mental illness or not. The goal of Up to Me is not to convince you to disclose. It is to empower you to make the choice yourself, given all of the costs and benefits, both short-term and long-term. It's important to remember that we talked about the fact that disclosure could happen in a variety of settings and to a variety of people in your life. And the costs and the benefits might look different depending on the setting and the person. And then it's also important, as we just talked about in the last section of the last worksheet, 1.3, to think about your goals for disclosure and also to try to anticipate in advance how you think things will go if you do decide to disclose. So the next lesson, which you will receive in a week, another email from Nayla with a new set of worksheets, and the manual will be reattached, the workbook I should say will be reattached, so you won't have to dig for it. The next lesson is lesson 2, and that has a couple of different tasks associated with it. So lesson 2 is titled "There Are Different Ways to Disclose." So task 1 of that lesson is learning about the different ways to disclose. Task 2 is, let's see, don't have these memorized. Is deciding to whom you might disclose. And I don't know if there's a task 3, is there?
It says task 3, we consider how others might respond to your disclosure.
Listed right there on the page. So you could find these on page 18 of your workbook. But thank you, Nayla, for rescuing me from my moment of awkwardness as I thumbed through the pages of the workbook. So we really do hope you enjoyed yourself today during this session. Do you want to add anything before you close, Nayla?
No, I think that's great. Just another emphasis on, make sure that you save the workbook, make sure that you save the PDF of the completed workbook that you have, so that you can look back on it for future decisions. And I think we might refer back to it in future lessons as well.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.